There's a wedding photograph hanging in an old house in the Shenandoah Valley that should not feel as wrong as it does. At first glance, it's just another 19th century bridal portrait, a pale girl in lace. A dark-suited groom standing beside her. Formal, stiff, respectable. But the longer you look at it, the more your eyes start to rebel. The girl stays clear, the flowers stay clear. The chair, the wallpaper, the ribbon at her waist, all of it stays sharp. Only the husband seems to slip. Not vanish exactly, just refuse to become fully known. The date written on the back is 1894. The bride was 14 years old, and according to every family record that survived, every town memory, every interview collected decades later, nobody could ever properly describe the man she married. That should be impossible. But it wasn't an isolated case, it was a pattern. For well over a century, every firstborn daughter in the Harrow family married at 14. Every ceremony happened in late September. Every groom appeared suddenly, took vows before witnesses, settled into the house, fathered a daughter, and then existed in the strangest possible way. People knew he was there, they spoke around him, they nodded when his name came up. But if you pressed for details, anything real, where he came from, what his family was, what color his eyes were, what kind of laugh he had, the answers just dissolved. People would blink, hesitate, and say something weak, like, "Oh, he was ordinary enough?" Then they'd go blank. The daughters never explained it, not in letters, not in diaries, not in confession, not even when they were dying. By 15, each girl was pregnant. By 16, she had given birth to another daughter. Then the wheel turned again. This wasn't campfire folklore. It was sitting in courthouse books, marriage registers, church ledgers, census rolls, and family Bibles, with the corners worn soft by hands that did not want to keep opening them. And the more you read, the more one ugly thought starts building in your mind. Maybe the curse wasn't the marriage. Maybe the curse was the forgetting. The Harrows came to Virginia in 1769. They were prosperous tobacco merchants with enough education and enough money to become permanent very quickly. The family patriarch, Elias Harrow, built a large hilltop house outside Staunton and settled in like a man who expected his surname to matter long after he was gone. He had sons, yes, but it was his eldest daughter, Eliza, who became the center of everything that followed. In 1783, when Eliza turned 14, the family announced her engagement. The wedding took place on September 21st. Guests came in carriages, wine was opened, musicians played. There are surviving descriptions of the food, the weather, the flowers, even the ivory comb pinned into Eliza's hair. People remembered all of it. They remembered that she looked terribly young. They remembered that she stood so still during the vows, one aunt believed she might faint. But the groom? In the family Bible, his name appears only as Simon. No surname, no parents, no birthplace, no trace before the wedding. No trace of a life outside the marriage afterward either. Eliza's younger sister mentioned him once in a letter. "He seems agreeable," she wrote, and then, almost weirdly, added, "Or at least I believe I must have found him agreeable." The sentence trails off in a blot of ink, as if she herself lost confidence halfway through the thought. 10 months later, Eliza gave birth to a daughter. She lived into old age. Her husband remained in the house for decades, yet when her grandchildren were questioned much later, none could explain him. One said she remembered a man behind a study door, but could never quite bring herself to open it. Another insisted he had carried her once as a child, though she could not recall the sound of his voice. Then Eliza's daughter Ruth turned 14. September 21st, another wedding. Another groom known only by a first name. Another daughter born the following year. That's how this kind of thing takes root. Not as one dramatic event everyone recognizes, it settles in through repetition. By the time people understand they're living inside a pattern, the pattern already feels older than they are. The first real crack appeared with Catherine Harrow in 1824. Catherine kept a diary. Not a dramatic one, just ordinary things. Needlework, weather, family meals, little complaints about cousins and chores. Then the entries stop 2 days before her wedding. The next page, written months later in a trembling hand, contains only one line. "I know now why Mother would not speak of it." That's it. The rest of the diary is blank. Catherine lived another 50 years and never wrote a single word after that sentence. Her daughter later said Catherine had a habit of checking doorways at night, not looking through them, looking at them, as if she expected something to cross the threshold. She locked interior doors. She slept lightly. Sometimes she would sit awake until dawn, with a lamp lit beside the bed, and refuse to explain why. A daguerreotype from the 1850s shows Catherine seated with her children while a figure stands behind them, one hand resting on her shoulder. The suit is visible. The stance is visible. But where the face should be, the image breaks into a strange pale blur. Not damage, according to later analysis. Not a chemical flaw. Something about the exposure simply failed to hold him. That same impossible vagueness follows every groom in the Harrow line. By the late 19th century, people in the area had started treating the family with a strange mixture of respect and unease. Publicly, it was all admiration. The Harrows stayed wealthy. Their crops held. Their businesses never seemed to fail. War passed through the valley and somehow left their main house untouched. Recessions that ruined neighboring families barely seemed to graze them. On paper, it looked like luck. In whispers, it felt like payment. There are Civil War diaries from officers passing nearby who mentioned the house and refused to stop there. One man wrote that the property felt watched in a way he couldn't explain, as if the hill itself had decided we should keep riding. He did. The town noticed the daughters too, of course, girls who vanished into marriage at 14, and came back older than they should have seemed. Husbands nobody could quite picture, but whenever curiosity rose high enough to become dangerous, it slid away. Questions evaporated. The feeling of alarm faded. That might be the most frightening part of the entire history. Not just that something was wrong, but that whatever was wrong seemed able to protect itself by dulling the minds of anyone who got too close. In 1902, a Richmond journalist named Vera Collier traveled to the valley to write about old Virginia families. She spent several days collecting records and interviewing people. Her surviving notes, found much later in a trunk belonging to her sister, show that she had identified the pattern clearly. 14-year-old brides, nameless grooms, missing details everywhere. She even interviewed a former servant who claimed the house had rooms where the air did not feel right, like something was listening. On the fourth day, Vera went to the Harrow estate to request a formal interview. She returned to Richmond a week later with all her belongings and none of her memory. Her editor asked about the story. "What story?" she said. Her notes were still hidden in her trunk. She refused to read them. Her sister later wrote that even hearing the Harrow name seemed to give Vera a headache so severe she had to lie down in a dark room. So the cycle continued. Then, in 1946, it nearly broke. Her name was Vivian Harrow. She was born in 1932, and unlike the women before her, she started asking questions early. She found the old wedding photographs in the attic. Row after row of pale girls in white standing beside men whose faces felt slippery to the eye. She found her mother's portrait, and her grandmother's, and her great-grandmother's. She sat among them in the dust until her mother came looking for her. Instead of snatching the photographs away, her mother sat down beside her and said, very quietly, "It is not as terrible after the first year." That was not comfort. That was surrender. That night, Vivian heard her mother begging her father for more time. She never understood his reply. She only said later that his voice did not sound like a voice. It sounded like wind forced through something hollow. The next morning, her father was gone. Not dead, not packed and departed. Just absent in the strange, total way Harrow husbands always became absent when they chose to. Vivian understood enough then to do what nobody before her had done. She ran. In February of 1946, she boarded a bus north with stolen cash and a borrowed coat and disappeared into Baltimore under another name. For several months, it worked. She rented a room, took work in a department store, told people her parents were dead. She wrote letters she never mailed about nightmares in which she stood in a room with no doors while someone breathed behind her. She wrote that she kept seeing the man she was meant to marry in crowds. Except the face was never the same face twice. Then September came. On the morning of September 21st, her landlady found Vivian unconscious on the floor of her locked room. The windows were shut. The door had been bolted from the inside. No sign of entry. no sign of struggle. But Vivian was wearing a white dress no one in the house had seen before, and a ring sat on her left hand. She woke in a hospital 3 days later with no memory of how it happened. By October, she was back at the Harrow house. She never tried to flee again. The year after that, she gave birth to a daughter named Helen, and for the first time in the family's known history, someone chose to speak. When Helen was 12, Vivian told her everything. Not enough to explain it fully, because maybe it couldn't be explained fully, but enough to say this much out loud: you do not have to accept this quietly. Vivian hired a lawyer to try to emancipate Helen from the household before her 14th birthday. The lawyer took the case, prepared the papers, and then later claimed he had no memory of meeting her. His secretary found the documents shredded in his office. Vivian appealed to a priest. He entered the house one August afternoon and was never seen again. The family insisted he had left. Neighbors insisted they never saw him come back down the drive. Police searched and found nothing. By the time Helen's wedding arrived, Vivian was frantic. She tried to drive her daughter away. The car failed. She tried to hide her. Helen somehow returned to her room in the night. She tried to board up the house. On the morning of the ceremony, she woke to find her daughter already dressed in white, standing in the parlor beside a man she later described only this way. He looked like a husband. Like what your mind supplies when it is told there must be a husband there. That line has never left me, because it says exactly what these men seem to be. Not people in the ordinary sense, more like roles wearing flesh badly. The marriage happened. The certificate was filed. No one intervened. Helen gave birth to a daughter the following summer. By then, the modern world had supposedly arrived. Child marriage laws existed, social services existed, judges and clerks and teachers and doctors existed. And still the Harrow weddings passed through the system untouched, as if every layer of scrutiny simply slid off them. That was the true horror. Not just one family curse in one old house, but a blind spot wide enough for institutions to keep participating in it without even realizing they had done so. The line finally broke only because the next generation bent in an unexpected direction. Helen's daughter, Charlotte, later had no daughters of her own. Only sons. The pattern ended not in victory, but in exhaustion, in attrition, like something old had simply run out of the exact bloodline it required. The house was sold in the 1990s. Nobody stays long. Every owner reports the same things. Doors locking on their own, footsteps in hallways. The feeling that someone is standing just outside the edge of your sight. The current owner wants out. And then there's the final detail, the one that turns this from a single family's nightmare into something much larger. The Harrows were not alone. There are scattered records of other families, different names, different estates, same pattern. Daughters married too young, grooms impossible to remember. Families that prospered while their girls disappeared into marriages that looked normal from a distance and wrong up close. So maybe this was never one curse, maybe it was a contract. Maybe somewhere in the late 18th century, one desperate or greedy ancestor asked for protection, prosperity, survival, and got exactly what was requested. Only not in any way a sane person would have agreed to if the cost had been spoken plainly. One daughter every generation. One husband no one can truly know. One line of wealth protected by a silence so strong it could blur memory itself. The Harrow daughters are done now. The line that fed whatever this was has ended. But I keep wondering how many other families are still living inside arrangements they do not fully understand. How many wedding portraits still hang in old houses with brides too young and husbands too vague, waiting for somebody to look long enough to realize the face beside the girl never quite comes into focus. Because the most terrifying thing in this story is not the ghostly husband or the old house or even the impossible forgetting. It is the idea that some bargains do not take money, some bargains take daughters,